lagging. No, okay. Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Saber. My name is Sukman. I'm a PhD candidate here at the Department of Psychology, and I'm also a member of the KCL-SJP. I've also been tasked with the impossible task of actually introducing Noam's career in some opening remarks. So let's do that first. Noam Chomsky wrote his first article at the age of 9 in 1939 about the fall of Barcelona to Franco's fascists. Since then, he's been a tireless activist for peace and justice around the world, and calling out state lies and disillusioning us of their necessary illusions. In fact, so meticulous is this documentation of state crimes that the New Yorker labeled him the devil's accountant. His systematic interrogation of power, authority, and empire has been done over 150 books, countless articles, and numerous public engagements. On the side, he also revolutionized the fields of linguistics, the cognitive sciences, and analytic philosophy. He's also emeritus professor at MIT, where he taught for over 60 years, and currently he's a laureate professor at the University of Arizona. But particularly since 1967, he's been one of the most vocal advocates for the Palestinian cause in the West. He's written numerous groundbreaking books on the topic, The Triangle, on Palestine and Gaza in crisis. And almost 9 decades since he wrote his first article, he's showing no signs of relenting, thankfully. So he's still teaching, he's still writing, and still speaking truth against power. So I'd like to welcome you all to this event, which is titled Israel, Apartheid and Activism, a conversation with Noam Chomsky. So we'll like to begin the conversation with the title, which can be controversial to some perhaps, and given this is Israeli Apartheid Week and given the term apartheid in the title, we'll begin with that loaded term apartheid. So I'll frame my question with a recent semi-newsworthy event. So a few weeks ago in the Parliament, a Labour MP, Kim Johnson, at Prime Minister Questions, she asked Rishi Sunak what he thought about the Amnesty International's definition of Israel as an apartheid state and what they're doing to tackle that. Within hours, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader's office, jumped into action and threatened her with a whip and demanded her to retract the statement, saying that the statement of calling Israel an apartheid state was unacceptable. Within a few days, Kim Johnson appeared in Parliament and sorry, can everyone accept Noam actually unmute their, thank you. So within a few days, Kim Johnson appeared in Parliament and apologized for the statement, saying, I would like to apologize unreservedly for the intemperate language I used. I apologize for the use of the term apartheid state. While I was quoting accurately Amnesty International's description, I recognize this is insensitive and I would like to withdraw it. Now, Professor Chomsky, I know that you disagree with the use of the term apartheid, but not because it's not strong enough. Sorry, not because it's too strong, but rather it's not strong enough. So I've got my first question is, how useful is the framework of apartheid in understanding and responding to the Israeli occupation? And how would you like to elaborate why you think Israel is worse than apartheid South Africa?
Well, I'm pleased that Amnesty International and also Human Rights Watch have joined the civilized world in recognizing the fact of apartheid in Israel and the occupied territories. Britain, which is following loyally behind its master in Washington, particular Keir Starmer's, refused to go along with this. But I'm talking about people who consider themselves part of a civilized community. My own view for many years is I've written is that the concept of apartheid in Israel and the occupied territories could be more nuanced. There is a distinction which Israel no longer recognizes between Israel within its legal borders, so-called Green Line, and the occupied territories. which Israel alone in the world claims are not occupied, but I'll go along with the world. So there's a split between Israel and the occupied territories. Israel barely recognizes it anymore. Young people in Israel aren't even aware that there is a green line. City of Tel Aviv recently tried to use maps in the schools that recognize the green line. The government angrily objected. They had to withdraw it. But I'll still keep to it. The international consensus is that, apart from a distinction between Israel and the occupied territories, within Israel itself, there is quite severe repression and violation of rights of Palestinians. Whether it should be called apartheid or not, you could debate. I personally would call it severe repression, not apartheid. In the occupied territories, however, it's much worse than South African apartheid for a very simple reason. South Africa population was maybe 85% Black. The white nationalist ruling element relied upon the Black population. They set up Bantustans, but they tried to make them acceptable to the international community. Some subsidies, some support, didn't get very far, but at least there was an effort to try to present some form of structure in which the Black population would be recognized. Israel is totally different. They have no interest in the Palestinians in the occupied territories. They basically want them to leave. If they could leave, it would be fine. So make life impossible for them and hope that they'll somehow disappear step by step, not just going on for a century, actually. Small steps, step by step, we take over a little more. This is, of course, this is the way the initial settlement took place starting a century ago. Since 1967, it's been a systematic policy of establishing a kind of greater Israel, which would include, the structure has been pretty much fixed since the 67 war. The idea is to include within it, integrate within Israel, everything of any value in the West Bank. Talk about Gaza separately. In the West Bank, take over the Syrian Golan Heights, expand Jerusalem. What's now called Jerusalem is about 5 times the size of what it ever was. Includes lots of Arab villages that were being dispossessed. So a vastly expanded Jerusalem. Take over the Jordan Valley, step by step, expel the population. About a third of the land of the country that's useful for agriculture and other resources. There's a salient expanding east of Jerusalem to the town of Ma'ale Adumim, mostly built in the 1990s, that pretty much bisects the habitable part of the West Bank. Another one to the north to the town of Ariel, another to Kadumim, that sort of breaks up the area. Incorporate slowly, step by step, the Palestinian villages that remain within the area that Israel wants to integrate within the country. Avoid the heavy population concentrations. So Israel does not want to integrate, to bring Nablus into Israel. That would cause a problem. It's euphemistically called the demographic problem, the problem of too many non-Jews in what is called in a Jewish state, a state for Jewish primacy. Meanwhile, the remaining Palestinians are sequestered and almost by now a couple hundred homes.
عايز in America خلي مرتي the video call.
Well, there's I think 170 small enclaves where Palestinians are surrounded by Israeli troops who will occasionally, if they feel like it, let them go out and farm their lands, tend their cattle, tend their olive groves. Meanwhile, violent hilltop youths, as they're called, settle technically illegally, but they're supported by the government and the army. And they come in and when they feel like it, attack the villages, destroy property, beat people up. They're protected by the Israeli army, which stands there to make sure that in case any Palestinian resists, they're quickly arrested or shot. Well, that's considerably worse than apartheid. That's the situation that's being slowly, steadily imposed in the occupied territories. The United States and Britain pretend they don't see this. Of course they see it. They see it perfectly well. So I think what we basically have, I would describe as a system that is not quite apartheid, repressive within Israel proper, much worse than apartheid in the South African sense, in the occupied territories. The Golan Heights, meanwhile, has just been Syrian Golan Heights, population mostly expelled, has been incorporated into Israel. Under President Trump, for the first time, the United States officially authorized the illegal integration of the Golan Heights, Greater Jerusalem, into Israel. This is, of course, in gross violation of international law. In fact, in both cases, violation of Security Council resolutions, which the United States itself voted for at the time, but that's water under the bridge. Now, thanks to people like Donald Trump, Keir Starmer, others, Israel has just taken over these territories, and it's recognized by the United States and its British colony, but not technically by the rest of the world. Well, can talk about Gaza, that's a separate problem. But in my view, to get back to your question, the international human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, have taken the proper step when they move towards recognizing that this is basically an apartheid type situation. I don't see much that's controversial about that, except that my own view, as I say, I think in the occupied territories, it's more extreme than apartheid.
Well, given the similarities and also the clear differences that you pointed out and the severity of the situation, as soon as the framework of apartheid started gaining traction, another conversation that was starting was about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Israel. Given the current situation and where diplomacy appears to be failing, what do you think is the future and perhaps the benefit of mass BDS?
Well, we should be a little careful about BDS. First of all, it's actually BD. There aren't any sanctions. Maybe there ought to be, but there aren't. Secondly, this program was actually initiated within Israel in the late 1990s by Gush Shalom, Uri Avneri's peace group within Israel, organized a boycott and divestment program, which has had considerable success. Maybe their major success is that one of the major churches in the United States, the Presbyterian Church, joined in boycott and divestment. It's quite a step. Made some steps. Their goal was to try to compel multinational corporations that invest in the occupied territories to pull out. Their program was aimed at the occupied territories. In my view, that was tactically and wise, and also wise in principle. That's the main issue. So the BDS movement later developed. It's had its successes, it's had its failures. And if you look at it, I think its successes, which are significant, were overwhelmingly when it directed its efforts to the occupied territories. There, the issue is clear, precise, uncontroversial, outside of places like Keir Starmer's Labour Party, and Donald Trump and so on. But it's clear internationally what the issues are, and the strong support for it, popular and even international institutions. When you move the actions towards Israel proper, it tends to elicit, putting aside principle, it on purely tactical grounds, it elicits a backlash which typically overwhelms the effort. And you get sidetracked into discussions about academic freedom, anti-Semitism, distinction between Israel and other countries. There are answers to those questions, but by getting sidetracked into them, you're putting aside the problems of the Palestinians. They move to the side. So now, for example, in the United States, a lot of the activity of the BDS movement is concerned with overthrowing laws that are imposed and administrative procedures, even in universities, that require opposition to BDS. They're, of course, illegitimate, but concentrating on getting rid of those issues is not helping the Palestinians. It's putting the Palestinian issue to the side. So my own feeling is that on tactical grounds alone, let alone anything else, the BDS movement would be wise to concentrate its activities, which can be quite successful, on establishing that the territories are illegally occupied in gross violation of international law, carrying in violation of the decisions of the World Court, every relevant international institution, and that what's going on there is vicious and brutal. If you read the Israeli press, it's the main newspaper, practically every day there's a report of some violent, brutal activity of the settlers, supported by the army, sometimes by the army itself. Sometimes it reaches the level of an actual pogrom, as in Hawara a couple of weeks ago, but it's practically a daily occurrence, one atrocity and crime after another, as this policy of establishing Greater Israel more firmly continues. The areas are integrated into Israel with huge infrastructure projects. You can now live in your pleasant villa in Ma'ale Adumim in the midst of the West Bank, subsidized, of course, by the government. And you can travel on a superhighway to your job in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. You won't even know that there's an Arab anywhere. The roads, of course, are reserved to Israeli Jews and, of course, tourists. So you go to visit, you're allowed to drive on the roads, not Palestinians. Palestinians are consigned to small roads. I've actually driven on them. You want to get from Jerusalem from the East Jerusalem to Ramallah, you go on a small road right over a wadi. If it's raining, you might fall in. It takes you an hour or so. You could make it in 10 minutes on a highway. Well, that's all of that is, as I say, I think beyond apartheid. For the life of the Palestinians in the couple hundred sequestered settlements, it's a matter of survival. Will I be able to go out and tend my flock today, or will I be attacked by hilltop youth with the army watching on? Well, it's kind of a life, but the idea is get rid of them. We can get rid of them, be more Jews, be a fuller Jewish state. Now something new has happened in the last couple of weeks, something important. One of the most astute and knowledgeable analysts of Israeli policy, particularly the settlements for many years, has been Amira Haas, fine journalist and political analyst. Had an article a couple of days ago in Haaretz, the Israeli press, in which she pointed out, I think accurately, that Israel is not a state with a settlement enterprise. It's a settlement enterprise with a state. The dominant force in Israeli policy is the settlement, she calls colonial settlement enterprise. It has a Knesset, a parliament, it has a state, it has an army, but it's dominated. And she says there's been a kind of she calls it a tango between the state and the settler movement. Settler movement makes a couple steps forward. The Supreme Court says, no, I'm sorry, you can't do that. And then a couple of weeks later, it says, yes, you can do it. And the settler movement moves forward, and then the tango proceeds. Now, she says, it's followed the natural course, and the settler enterprise is turning against the secular policy, the secular population within Israel proper. So you're getting huge demonstrations and protests. You're trying to do to us what you've done to Palestinians for 50 years. It's not acceptable. So large demonstrations, a large part of the military are refusing to serve for pretty good reasons. A couple hundred Air Force reservists refuse to go for training. You can understand their reasons. As long as the facade of a military occupation could be maintained, Israel could claim to be immune to international prosecution for war crimes. The ICC principle is that if a country has a functioning judiciary, it can take care of its own war crimes. Of course, that's a farce, but that's the official facade. But right now, by now, the facade of a military occupation is declining. Now there's a civil authority in control of the occupied territories. That's the new far-right religious nationalist government, Smotrich and Ben Gvir and Levin and the judiciary. So the facade is disappearing. There are a few people who will maintain it. Donald Trump, Keir Starmer, a couple of other loyalists, but it's disappearing. And reservists don't want to be exposed to that. Of course, the US would immediately step in and block it, but they don't want to face the danger. So I think what we see is the facade crumbling, the reality coming to the fore. There are interesting and important changes in political opinion, particularly, I don't know the facts about Britain, but in the United States, extensive polls, it now turns out that among the younger people, high school, college age that's called Generation Z. They're split almost 50-50 between support for Israel and support for Palestinians. It's a radical change from what happened before. If you look at the party distinctions, the support for Israel used to be based on liberal Democrats. Israel had this image of a progressive, forward-looking liberal state. Liberal Democrats could support it. It's gone. By now, those who identify as Democrats support Palestinians much more than they support Israel. Support for Israel has, in the United States now, is based on the huge evangelical community, on religious nationalists, on the security systems, which are the military, the police, which are closely integrated with Israel. That's Israel's comparative advantage internationally, and on right-wing ultranationalists generally. That's an enormous shift, and it's a very unstable situation. The government so far has kept to the traditional policy of supporting Israel no matter what. The Biden administration has adopted the Trump policies of authorizing integration of Jerusalem and the Golan Heights and expanding settlements. But it's a fairly open society. There's a limit to the extent to which a government can simply disregard popular opinion. So I think there might be changes in the offing. You're already beginning to see them. Bernie Sanders, who's is the voice of progressive forces in the United States, has come out recently and said the unspeakable is U.S. aid to Israel should be conditioned on ending extreme human rights violations in the occupied territories. There's already legislation in Congress, so far not many supporting it. Betsy McCollum calling for the termination of U.S. aid unless Israeli policies are radically changed. These are significant developments. They offer options and opportunities for people who want to overcome this long-standing crime. And I think maybe those opportunities can be grasped sufficiently to bring about changes of policy in Israel. Now, here another issue arises. Until very recently, whenever the United States put its foot down, ordered Israel to do something which it didn't want to do, it backed down and did what the United States commanded. That's actually true of every US president, from Reagan up through George Bush II. Obama was the first American president not to impose any demands on Israel. But in the past, when demands were made, even if Israel strongly opposed them, they obeyed because they're so reliant on the United States. Now, with the current government, the religious nationalist government, it's not so obvious that they'll do that. Actually, they have God on their side. Why do they have to listen to the United States? That could lead to a quite intriguing situation if it develops. I think that's basically the way it looks now.
And you briefly touched on the protests that are happening in Israel at the moment. For those who don't know, Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to push through some judicial reforms which will basically allow the Knesset to override Supreme Court rulings. And he's got a very slim majority in the Knesset, 61 to the total 120 seats. So there are weekly protests happening now, I think coming up to 500,000 people a week. But ironically, they're claiming to fight for democracy, a democracy where they've disenfranchised 5 million Palestinians, a democracy in the true Orwellian sense where, we're all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. But I want to ask you, with what's currently happening there and this turmoil, what does this tell you about Israeli society as it currently stands, and whether or not the judicial reforms will actually change anything for Palestinians, or indeed even Arabs living in Israel?
We should, first of all, recognize that Netanyahu has a prime concern. That's to stay out of jail. He's doing everything he can to stay out of jail. And one of the ways to do it is to get control over the courts, which he's being on the verge of trials for pretty serious crimes. So that's his personal concern. Let's basically suspend the courts. But as for your point, I think it's essentially what's been happening generally. The facade is being lifted. The whole concept of a democratic Jewish state was an oxymoron to begin with. You can't have a democratic Christian state unless the Christianity is just symbolism. So maybe you take off on Sunday instead of Saturday or Friday. As long as the Christianity is symbolism, yes, you can have a democratic Christian state. When it goes beyond symbolism, it's a joke. And in Israel, it's always gone far beyond symbolism, way back. So it was never a tenable concept. Now the reality is coming into immediate awareness. You see it exactly as you say. You see it with the protests. Massive protests against the fact that, as Amira Haas put it, the program of a settler enterprise with the state is now being turned against secular Jews. And they're protesting vigorously, massive protests. Nothing about Palestinians in the protest, barely a word. A few people in what remains of the marginal Israeli left do say something here and there, but the mass of the protests don't even consider, it's not even an issue. They don't even think about it. The problem is that the weight of the settler enterprise is now being directed against us. I mean, personally, I support the protests. I'm glad they're taking place. I think what's happening within Israel is extremely dangerous, but we should not be misled about it. It's an effort to establish the Jewish-dominated entity. In fact, that's part of the basic law by now. It was established officially in 2018 that this is that Israel is the state of the Jewish people. Actually, that's not so much of a change as many people believed. You go back to about 1960, the Supreme Court, Israeli court, had already concluded that Israel is the sovereign state of the Jewish people. That means it's my state because I'm Jewish, but it's not the state of Palestinians in Israel. Well, that wasn't a strong official decision at the time, but that was the reality. 2018, it became official. Now it's coming forward. You can see it right in front of you. Anyone with eyes open can see it. Possible to blind yourself and pretend something else is going on, but it's getting more and more difficult to take that stance.
Okay, now zooming a little out, I wanted to ask you about, well, actually in the past couple of weeks and then the past couple of years, there have been some developments which kind of shifted the dynamics and diplomatic ties within the region. So I'm thinking about the Abraham Accords, which were signed 2 years ago involving Morocco, the UAE and Bahrain. And now recently the role of China in bringing back Iran and Saudi Arabia onto the table. What difference do you think these changes have made over the past years in one way emboldening Israel, but then getting Israel to criticize the deal that was made between Iran and Saudi Arabia? So what do you see the effects of these events in the coming future?
These are very important events. For many years, back to 1967, in fact, there had been a tacit alliance between the Arab oil dictatorships in Israel. U.S. policy in the region had been, from 67, had been based on what were sometimes called three pillars: Saudi Arabia, where all the oil is; Israel, the muscle; Iran, then under the Shah. Technically, they were all at war with each other, but that was just technically. In fact, there were pretty close relations among them, but it was informal. The Abraham, of course, Iran in 1979 shifted from a trusted ally to a main enemy. In the Abraham Accords were an attempt to bring together an alliance of the most reactionary and brutal states in the region under the U.S. aegis. Morocco was brought in because of its dictatorship, of course, was brought in because of its near monopoly of phosphate reserves. In fact, President Trump, along with recognizing the Israeli occupation, also violated international law by recognizing the Moroccan conquest of Western Sahara, violation of United Nations decisions and others. And that's to expand Morocco's monopoly over phosphate. So they were, the Moroccan dictatorship was brought in for that reason. Bahrain, which is a Saudi satellite virtually, was brought in. Egypt is not technically a member, but in fact, de facto it is. Saudi Arabia is essentially a partner, United Arab Emirates, and Sudan was brought in under strong pressure, threats that unless they joined, they would be punished, so they were brought in. Israel provides the technology, the muscle, and so on. That's the idea. It was to be a basic alliance of reactionary states under U.S. control aimed at Iran. China, through undermined this. China moved in with, just recently, with a diplomatic initiative that extended what had already been slowly happening, a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, two major states in the region. It's a serious blow to the United States and Israel. It throws a wrench into the U.S. policy of coordinating an alliance of reactionary states against Iran. Well, it doesn't destroy it, but it undermines it. Should mention that a lot these things have been going on for some time. So China is expanding its investment development loan program throughout Eurasia, so-called New Silk Road, it's sometimes called. But there's also a maritime Silk Road. China's extending its diplomatic efforts to develop it's called the Maritime Silk Road across the south of Eurasia with ports. One of its hubs is the United Arab Emirates. That's one of the main hubs for the Maritime Silk Road, it leads into the Gulf. Well, now that's becoming more formalized with the expanding Chinese initiatives. It's one of the things you just can't stop with guns. The advantage of the United States has always been its military force. Well, the things you can't do with guns. So China, of course, the United States is basically trying to organize, it's trying to integrate Europe into its growing conflict with China. That's why in its last NATO session, NATO expanded its reach to the Indo-Pacific region, assuming that Europe would quietly go along with the United States the way Britain does. The world system is shaping up in which there are going to be sharp confrontations between the US dominated system, almost reflexively includes Britain, might include Europe, than the rest of the world. A lot of it's going in a different direction. Almost none of the world outside of Europe and, of course, Britain going along with US sanctions in Russia. There was a meeting important meeting of the international meeting at the Munich a couple of weeks ago, Munich Strategic Conference, where the United States was trying hard to get the countries of the global South to join in with what they see as a proxy war between Russia and the United States with Ukrainian bodies. None of them wanted to join. One after another got up and said, sorry, not us. Even long-time US virtual satellites like Colombia, South America. But they're just making their own, India, Indonesia, African countries, making their own arrangements with Russia, with China. The United States is trying, and Britain are trying desperately to stop this, but it's not at all clear where it'll develop. And the particular issue you mentioned, Abraham Accords and the Chinese initiative with Saudi Arabia and Iran, are part of the breakup of this system. The Chinese initiative, if it succeeds, might have enormous effects. For one thing, it just might bring to an end the horrifying atrocities in Yemen. Yemen is maybe the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And it's Saudi Arabia with US and British backing are the main aggressors, the ones major responsible for this awful crisis. Iran has been supporting the Houthi forces, which are on the other side. Conceivably, in fact, both Iranian and Saudi diplomats have said that they can now think of a way to resolve the tension. If that turns out correct, it'll be an enormous step forward, a great blow to the United States and Britain, which have been strongly supporting the Saudi attack that's led to this terrible crisis, the main factor that's led to it. Well, these are major things that are happening on the world scene.
Brilliant. And I think now I'd like to move on to some of the more immediate consequences of activism, particularly when people want to get involved with Palestinian activism. There's a sense of trepidation of what might happen, especially when I give the example of the Labour Party earlier on. I mean, you faced a lot of hostility for your position, and often you needed security to take you from one event to another. And here in the UK, we've got a case study of the last few years of a leader of a major political party who had a very open pro-Palestinian stance, and he was essentially dragged through the mud by the entire establishment, from the Guardian through to the Telegraph. So you actually followed Jeremy Corbyn's career quite closely and his tenure as the Labour leader. How much of the propaganda against Jeremy do you think was, and now his subsequent banishment from mainstream politics, how much of that do you think was due to his Palestinian position? And through Jeremy's case study and your own experience, what lessons can we all take about engaging in political, academic and public life in the UK, given our orientation, I suppose?
Well, don't like to talk about my own experience, but it is relevant. I've been speaking and writing about these issues openly, publicly, back into the 60s. Until pretty recently, I literally had to have police protection if I was talking at a university, even my own university. Campus police, city police had to be present. Police insisted on walking me back to my car because of the threat of violence. If I was giving talks on some other campus on, say, philosophy seminars, if there was one talk on Palestine, it had to be followed by campus police the whole time I was on campus. Of course, in the intellectual world, you just get denounced, vilified, and so on, but nobody cares about that. It changed. In the last 10 or 15 years, it's changed radically. The main change was with the huge Israeli attacks on Gaza, Cast Lead, others, these were so horrific that the population, especially younger people, just fell away from the solid support for Israeli violence and terror. Now it's a totally different situation. Students for Justice in Palestine, other groups have organized, made an enormous difference among young people. That's why you get the polling results that I just mentioned before. Enormous change. Well, let's go to England. In my view, the main reason for the attack on Corbyn across the spectrum, as you say, The Guardian, everyone else, was that he committed a major crime. He tried to create a Labour Party that would be responsive to the needs of its constituency and that would be a participatory party. And it was very successful. 2017, they had enormous victory. That scared the pants off the establishment. We cannot tolerate a political party that is actually a party, a popular party aimed at the needs and concerns of the large majority of the population. That's not the way politics works. Politics is for the elite and the privileged. So we have to smash this thing quickly. The technique that was used was a utterly dishonest, deceitful attack based on anti-Semitism. It's been completely exposed. The Al Jazeera reports totally exposed it, barely covered in England. There were formal reports. The Labour Party itself exposed it, but it's been suppressed. But my view is they picked the Palestinian issue and the issue of anti-Semitism because it's always easy to scream about anti-Semitism. It's an old story. It's nothing new. Back in 1973, 50 years ago, Abba Eban, respected Israeli settlement, particularly respected because he has a nice Oxford accent, so that makes him sound good. But he wrote an article in the major American Jewish liberal journal, American Jewish Congress Journal, Congress Weekly. He wrote an article in which he said he laid down the law to American Jews. He said, your prime responsibility is to show that there is no difference between anti-Semitism and what he called anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism meant opposition to the support to the policies of his government, Golda Meir Labor government. So your task is to show there's no distinction between anti-Semitism and opposition to the policies of my government. It's pretty straight, almost in those words. And that's been a consistent line ever since. The Anti-Defamation League, which used to be a civil rights organization, now it's just a lobbying organization for Israel. 40 years ago, they published a book called The New Anti-Semitism. What's the new anti-Semitism? Opposition to the US military budget, opposition to the Vietnam War. That's the new anti-Semitism. Why? Because it undermines US power, which is the basis for Israeli expansion and occupation. So that's the new anti-Semitism. Was written by the research director of the Anti-Defamation League. That's been a consistent line all along. The British media and the British establishment picked it up in the campaign against Corbyn. Call somebody an anti-Semite, what are they going to say? I'm not an anti-Semite. Make up some stories. He said something nice about Palestinians. He didn't say this or that, you know. It's a vicious, deceitful campaign, completely exposed with almost no opening. You just suppress the exposures because it's too important to destroy the possibility of a Labour Party that would actually be a functioning, participatory party working for the needs and interests of its working class and poor constituency. That's not tolerable.
Mm. Okay, thank you for that. We will move to some audience questions. So we've got around 33 participants online and got a hall for possibly 120 people here. They submitted some questions while signing up for the event. So the most frequently submitted question was about the viability of a two-state settlement at this moment. What are your thoughts?
There's a debate that's been going on for years, open public debate. Should we advocate a two-state settlement, or should we say it's finished, there's no chance, let's call for a one-state settlement? There's a couple of problems with that debate. One major problem is that it leaves out the third alternative, the one that is actually being implemented, Greater Israel. That's the policy that's been systematically implemented by Israel since 1967, very consciously, very carefully, supported by the United States, supported by Britain. Europe makes little noises of protest now and then, but hasn't impeded it. It's the program that I mentioned before. Incorporate the Golan Heights, incorporate vastly expanded Jerusalem, take over the Jordan Valley, break up the rest of Palestine into isolated enclaves, which are almost inviolable, exclude the population concentrations. Israel does not want the Arab population of Nablus and Jenin, Tulkarm. They don't want them. They should go somewhere else. That's the actual policy that's being implemented. You can't have a debate about alternatives if you omit what's actually happening. So the real question is, which of these three possibilities is possible? The one-state settlement, you can talk about it, but it's pie in the sky. It means that Israel is going to agree to be part of a Palestinian-dominated state with a Jewish minority. They'll never agree to that. I mean, if they had to, they'd use their ultimate weapons to stop it, if there ever were any international support for it. And there is no international support. Even, say, the African states, they're very jealous about sovereignty for very good reasons. They've lived through hundreds of years of colonial violence. Sovereignty is important to them. They're not supporting the disappearance of any state in the international system. I don't think there's much hope in this. I understand what the people who advocated are pursuing and support their goals. Let's try to achieve civil and human rights for Palestinians in the occupied territories. Could work up to a point at which it has political consequences. When it reaches the point where it has political consequence of Israeli Jews being a minority in a Palestinian state, it's not going to go beyond that. So the real alternatives, in my opinion, are continuation of the Greater Israel policy or support for some kind of two-state settlement. Well, two-state settlements commonly said is just gone, too much Israeli settlement. Maybe, but I don't really believe it. If the United States pulls out the rug from the Israeli settlement, they can't persist in it. Israel made a fateful decision back in the 1970s, the time of Abba Eban. Israel had many easy possibilities in the 70s of a negotiated settlement. It was right in the Security Council. I had a resolution calling for a two-state settlement on the international border, maybe some slight modifications. I'm quoting it now, with guarantees for the right of each state to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. That resolution was supported by the Arab confrontation states, by Egypt, Syria, Jordan, tacitly supported by the Palestinians, supported by the rest of the world, passionately opposed by the Israeli labor government. They bitterly condemned it, in fact, refused even to attend the sessions. The United States vetoed it. Happened again a couple times. Well, what happened is that Israel made the decision to sacrifice security for expansion. But that meant they had to be completely reliant on the world dominant power, the United States, to enable them to carry out this policy in the face of international opposition. And that's what's happened ever since. That's why when US presidents from Reagan up to Bush ordered Israel to do things it strongly opposed, it nevertheless agreed. As I said, Obama was the first break. Well, what does that mean? I think it means that if US policy shifts, and it might, given the changes in the popular mood and position, if the policy shifts, I think Israeli policy will shift. What about all the settlers? Well, they can be moved, they can decide, make a choice. They can stay in a Palestinian state, fine, or they can leave their subsidized homes in the occupied territories and move to subsidized homes within Israel proper. Remember that most of the settlers go there because you get a nice home in the suburbs, a nice villa, nice town, all subsidized by the government. There are religious nationalists who want to hold on to every rock. Many of them come from Brooklyn in the United States. Okay, they can stay. I don't think this is an insoluble problem. Difficult, but not necessarily insoluble. Well, that's a minority position. Very few people believe this, but it seems to me most of the discussion is kind of beside the point because it overlooks the actual developments that are taking place. It's not a choice between one state and two states. It's a choice between them and the actual policy of Greater Israel, backed by the United States, Britain, basically. And that doesn't have to continue. If that policy is withdrawn, it's a different world. I should say that there are other issues here that are not being discussed, but should be. One of them, crucial issue, has to do with the Iran nuclear programs. It's considered a major issue in world affairs. The greatest threat to world peace is Iranian nuclear programs. There's a very simple, elementary way to eliminate any concern about an alleged Iranian nuclear threat, if there is one. Let's say there is one. How do you eliminate it? Trivial. Establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Is there any problem about that? Arab states are strongly supported it for 30 years. Iran supports it. The global South totally strongly supports it, G77. Europe has no opposition. So why doesn't it happen? Because every time it comes up in an international forum, US vetoes it. Most recently, Obama. There's one or another pretext, but the reason is perfectly obvious to everyone. It would mean that Israel's nuclear programs have to be inspected. The United States does not officially recognize that Israel has nuclear programs. Of course, everyone knows that it has a huge nuclear arsenal, but the US won't recognize it for a very simple reason. If the US recognizes it, US law comes into play, which there's a very strong argument that because of Israel's nuclear programs, US aid to Israel is illegal under US law. neither political party in the United States wants to open that door. If the American population knew that we're facing a serious threat of war in the Middle East because we have to protect our aid to Israel, they wouldn't be very happy about it. In fact, the propaganda in the United States is so extreme that more people in the United States believe that Iran has nuclear weapons than believe that Israel does, which is pretty amazing propaganda achievement. It's kind of like the anti-Semitism thing in England. Pretty impressive propaganda achievement. About 60% of Americans think that Iran has nuclear weapons. Of course, even US intelligence says they don't have them, but they have no programs. It doesn't matter. All of this is pressed. Well, that can change. Yes, about activism, that's a door for activism. One of the main things that the pro-Palestinian activists should be doing is to lift the veil on this, bring people to understand what's happening. Could have a big effect. That's one of the reasons for the strong propaganda programs. Prevent people from knowing it, because if they know it, who knows what'll happen? Maybe the whole system will collapse, very much like the anti-Corbyn campaign on anti-Semitism. You have to keep certain things from being understood or thought. It's a point that Orwell made in 80 years ago. Everybody's read Animal Farm. Not many people have read the introduction to Animal Farm because it was unpublished. It was found many years later in his unpublished papers. The introduction to Animal Farm is directed to the people of England. It's called Literary Censorship in England. It says this book, Animal Farm, is a satire about the totalitarian enemy, but people in England shouldn't feel that self-righteous, because in England, free England, unpopular ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. It's an hour from now. Tell them. And then he discussed some ways. He says one of the ways is a good education, which inculcates into you the understanding that there are certain things it wouldn't do to say. When you internalize that, you're okay. That's free England. Same with free United States. Quite important. Fortunately, I'm afraid I have to go off to another interview. So,
no worries then. Well, again, for today's event, I want to thank everyone who helped organize the event and our friends from across London and other societies who brought everyone here. I want to thank Valeria Chomsky for working with us to put this event together, and most importantly, Professor Chomsky yourself for your time and your words. We all greatly appreciate it. So just a quick round of applause for
thank you. I'm sorry I have to leave, but obligations press.
Thank you very much, and have an excellent day. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. And if anyone's celebrating Ramadan Mubarak, have a great day. Thank you.